Today, I've prepared a short quiz for everyone, and just to make things more fun, I've invited one of my favorite YouTubers, Victor from Two Card Confidence, to attempt my quiz. Let's see how well he does. Okay, so question number one, in lines where it gets checked to the river, which hands are best to bluff with? Right, so if the flop has two spades, flop goes check, check, turn goes check, check, the board breaks up. Right? Would you prefer to bluff with spades or without spades?
So when it gets checked to the river, that means obviously a flop and turn were not being bet. And spades often would bet on earlier streets because they either are flush draws or they block flush draws. So getting to the river, basically both players probably have less spades overall and more non-spades. If you have spades on the river, then that means your opponent is going to have less spades. And that is probably a good thing because then it means they have more non-spades and those hands are going to fold more often. Yeah, I would say we prefer to bluff with spades.
Yeah, so that is correct. We prefer to bluff with spades. Okay, so just to show you an example, like two-tone board, it goes check, check, turn goes check, check. And if you look at what happens on the river, right, let's filter for our for the big blinds air hands, right? And what you can do with GTO Wizard is just include hands with two spades, and you see that they're bluffing all of the time. Right? Or if you exclude hands that have two spades, then you see that they're giving up a little bit more. Right? Of course, we still bluff some of them because we have to hit like a certain quota when it comes to bluffs. But in terms of the preference for which hands to bluff with, it's really clear that we have a strong preference for the spade combos, right? Specifically because of what you said about, so let's say if we make this 73% bet, right? And you take a look at your opponent's pair hands. Right? So a lot of this stuff that's folding, you can actually see like 10-7, for example, is making the spade combo. So this is exactly what you were talking about, right? 10-7 would have bet on the flop or the turn. So when big blind has spades, he actually doesn't block that many folds, right? He allows the button to have hands like 10-7 of hearts and 10-7 of clubs, right? Thereby making any kind of spade hand a more profitable bluff. Okay, so question number two. For UTG Open versus big blind call, let's say we have like a typical ace high board. Which line does a miss flush draw take the least frequently? Is it check, check, bet, 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 check, bet, or bet, bet, bet?
So I would pretty quickly rule out B and C, just because you will always have some hands, some flush draws that would check the flop and then bet on later streets, and betting the flop, then checking the turn, and then bluffing the river. So basically, bluffing the river, if you haven't bet all streets before, is exactly what we just talked about. That bluffing those hands on the river is a pretty good thing in terms of EV. For A and B, barreling through is probably not a really frequent line, just because if you bet on flop and turn and then you want to bluff the river, then having a missed flush draw obviously unblocks your opponent's folds, which is not something that you want to do too much. But still, I think that A is probably the correct answer, just relating back to the first question, that missed flush cards are just such a good bet on river. I mean, you just showed it to me, basically, that missed flush draws always want to bet on that specific flop. And I would guess that that is also the case for most other boards. I don't know how much ace high plays a role in this, actually. Maybe I should think about that for a second, but probably not going to do too long. Yeah, I'm not going to overthink it. I'll go with A.
Okay, so A is in fact correct. And I think a lot of people would have answered bet, 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 because they have this idea that with a flush draw, if you bet twice, your opponent's going to be check calling with a bunch of flush draws. And when you bet the river again, all of those hands are going to be folding. So your blockers are not going to be great. But still, let's say on ace 10 deuce with two spades. So we're going to have this region of flush draws. So let's filter for the unpaired flush draws. You can see they're all mixing on the flop, right? Betting sometimes, checking sometimes, and that's very typical of flush draws. You can take like almost any line with them, as long as you don't go check, check, check. Right? So let's say if we double barrel on the river, turns out that any line is fine as well. Right? It's not necessarily a mistake to be barreling miss flush draws, right? They are like kind of low frequency, right? So the general wisdom that we shouldn't bluff too many missed flush draws on the river is still correct, but it doesn't mean that we want to give up like all of our missed flush draws, right? But if you take a look at the check down line, right, what you'll see is that pure air needs to bluff all of the time, and it doesn't matter whether you have spades or you have hearts or you have clubs, right? Every single combo is just bluffing like 100% of the time. Okay, so there's a very important takeaway here, which is that even before you consider stuff like blockers, you have to first understand the nature of the situation. Right? So the nature of the situation here is that we have a board where UTG has a huge advantage. Right? Big blinds range is kind of wide, especially after we min raise pre-flop. Ton of hands, and we have this kind of like latent advantage, right? In the sense that if we make a tiny bet on the flop, right, big blind's going to massively overfold. It's folding 44% versus a 1/3 pot size bet, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to be bluffing with all of our air, right? You want to think about this as a latent advantage. You can bet now, opponent's going to overfold, right? Or you can check back on the flop. And on the turn, let's say if you go for this delay c-bet, big blind is also going to overfold. So I like to think about this as like the typical analogy I use here is to imagine that you have a certain check. Maybe you have a check for $1 million. Maybe you struck the lottery or something. Do you have to redeem the check immediately? Do you have to cash it in immediately today? Like, no, right? You could always choose to go tomorrow instead. If you have stuff on today, you can always wait till tomorrow and then you go cash in the check. Right? So that's
that's a cool analogy.
You can c-bet the flop and cash in on your range advantage right now, or you could also go for the delay c-bet and you're still cashing in on your range advantage. Right? So let's say you wait till tomorrow to cash in the check. Right? But the next day, tomorrow, you find that you have something last minute, you have something on also. Okay, so now you have to wait till the day after, which technically is also fine. You could always check back the turn. And then now on the river, you still have this option to cash in your check, and big blind is still going to, massively overfold versus pretty much like any bet size. Right? But if you fail to do that, let's say if you check back on the river, then essentially your check has expired. Right? Because the way that this check works is that you have like exactly 3 days to cash it in. If you wait till the forfeit, you just forfeit your $1 million. Right? So that's the reason why it actually doesn't matter whether you have a flush draw or not. Right? Either way, on ace high boards, assuming like a normal kind of run out, right, it's actually not GTO to just like check down some kind of airhead.
That was a great analogy, and also reminds you again that you have to start thinking about from the beginning of the hand how our range is composed and who has the advantage.
So button open versus big blind on a board of 10, 7, 4, two-tone with 9-8. So we have an open-ender, we c-bet, we get called. Turn is the jack of diamonds, so completing our straight but also completing the flush. Right? So with 9-8, do you think we should A, bet with the redraw, check without redraw, B, bet without the redraw, check with the redraw, C, bet both, or D, check both?
Typically, you can have the approach of thinking about redraws in terms of adding EV. So if you have a redraw, then of course you do have more EV because you can win against more hands if the draw gets there. So if you have more EV, then one way to think about it is that you want to put in more money into the pot. A different way to think about it is that you don't mind seeing the river, but that is such a non-scientific explanation of thinking about it. I would probably take the hand with a redraw and bet it more often, or if any would be bet more often, then I would probably go with the one with the redraw. But intuitively, like strictly speaking as a player, I would say that probably both are good enough to bet.
Okay, so final answer, bet both?
Yeah.
Okay, so it turns out, in theory, if you have 9-8 with no redraw, right, this type of hand tends to be a very high frequency check. So the correct answer is in fact A, bet with redraw and check without the redraw. So 10-7-4, right, we see bet, we get called, turn is a check. So that's filtered for straights. Okay, and what you see with hands like 9-8 is that they're betting pretty often with the redraw, right? But without the redraw, it's actually almost a pure check. Right? And this comes back to the fundamental reason why we bet any hand. Have you read any of Matthew Janda's books by any chance?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, there's I think his second book, No Limit Hold'em for Advanced Players or something like that. He talks about reasons for betting. Right? I mean, you have like the old school reasons, right? Bet for value, bet as a bluff, but nowadays we know that's not really correct, right? Because we also bet for equity denial. Right? So like a more modern set of reasons is, instead of saying that you bet for value, you can say that you bet to build a pot in case you win. Right? And I think you understand that pretty well because your first instinct was to bet a hand like 9-8, and you understand that having a redraw adds to your EV. And that has a lot to do with the first reason, right? Bet to build the pot in case you win. You know, with the redraw, you have like a higher chance of winning. You have more incentive to be building the pot because even if you run into like a small flash, you still have a chance to win, like a very big pot. Right? Second reason would be betting to deny equity. Right? So the thing about equity denial is that it's not as simple as it looks on the surface. Right? Saying that your hand denies equity is completely different from saying that there's a lot of rivers that you don't want to see. So with a hand 9-8 without diamond, right, it looks kind of vulnerable. There's a lot of rivers where you probably cannot value bet, right? But it turns out that this hand actually does not deny any significant amount of equity. So to really see how much equity your hand denies, you want to look at your opponent's folding range. And what you'll notice is that all the hands that are folding, they are pretty much drawing dead against our hand. So that's the problem with betting a hand like 9-8 of hearts. Like your hand, first of all, it might have decent equity when called, right? Because you can still, you know, get called by a bunch of worse hands like one pair, right, 10x. But of course, the times that you're behind, you're just drawing dead. Even the times that you're ahead, your opponent very often has some kind of a redraw. So equity when called is good, but not great, right? It's not as great as having a set, for example, right? Or some kind of a flash. And that's the problem with, you know, betting this hand because it denies literally zero equity. So to justify betting it, you need to have exceptional equity when called. Okay? And A9 just doesn't have good enough equity when called because of all these reasons I mentioned, right? The times that you're behind, you're dead. The times that you're ahead, your opponent has a bunch of outs.
So that was a good explanation, really. That helps a lot. It just makes me realize that I should have taken some of your coaching when I was focusing more on playing.
So question number 4. Small blind raises to 3 big blinds with aces and big blind calls. As the flop is getting dealt, small blind accidentally exposes it. So
I'm really bad at those things. Okay, let's go.
What is the best play with aces? Would you always bet? Would you always check? Or would you mix it up?
If he didn't saw my hand, then I would want to check and have him bet some bluffs, basically, because we would be check folding some hands. In this case, however, checking probably doesn't accomplish that much because they would just not bet their bluffs. Why would they bluff if they know they have zero fold equity?
Let's say if this situation really happens in the casino, I think a lot of players would be quite tempted to bluff you off. If the flop comes 7, 6 deuce, and your hand is kind of face up, right? And then big blind can still have all of the 2 pairs and the sets. I wouldn't just necessarily assume that he's never going to bet anything worse. Like that itself cannot be a valid equilibrium, right? Because let's say if you check and then he never bets anything worse, then you can just always fold versus his bet, right? And then he should be betting with a lot of worse hands.
That's true. So you're right. It cannot be the equilibrium. Yeah. Now that I think about it, there are so many arguments here, but one other argument would be that you are going to be handicapped for the rest of the hand, right? I mean, your opponent knows your hand basically. So why would you not do anything to keep the pot as small as possible? I would say I would actually always check it. Now I've gone back and forth, but that is my final answer.
Okay, so it turns out that the correct answer is actually to bet all the time.
All right.
And at first, this looks really strange, right? What does betting really accomplish? For the most part, your opponent's going to be raising you with all of these hands that beat you, right? And then mixing in a bunch of bluffs, or raising top pair, second pair as a bluff, and so on. Yeah, but I think the reason why aces wants to bet anyway is just because of equity denial. So it comes back to reasons for betting again, right? You bet to build the pot in case you win, which of course is not very important here, right? Your opponent isn't really doing that much calling. And when he's continuing, he's mostly doing it by raising. And then the moment he raises, your hand is just indifferent, right? So betting to build the pot in case you win, that's not really a thing here, right? But if you think about how much equity you're denying, right, you're actually folding out a ton of hands that, while they don't look like they have a lot of outs against you, right? But every single one of these combos actually has a runner 2 pair, runner trips, right? A lot of them have like backdoor straight and backdoor flush as well. Yeah. So my understanding of why aces is betting is that your opponent cannot prevent you from accomplishing at least one of 2 things. Like it's impossible for him to play a strategy whereby your equity when called is bad, and you also don't deny any equity. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Right? So for example, if your opponent just plays really straightforward and just folds like all of the 7x and 8x, just because he knows his beat, right? In that case, you would be denying a ton of equity because all of these hands, they're going to have 5 outs against you. Alternatively, if he tries to, let's say, float you on the flop and try to outplay you on the turn, or maybe just float to try and hit his 5-outer, right? Then in that case, you would deny less equity. Right? But of course, on the other hand, you would have much better equity when called. Okay? So it's like a lose-lose situation for your opponent, right? You can't really stop you from either having good equity when called or good equity denial. Right? And this is very reminiscent of situations where we have this big equity advantage, like when we 3-bet small blind versus button, and then the flop is like ace high or something. Right? If you think about the reason why we bet hands like kings and queens, right, it's pretty much the same thing. It looks a bit strange at first, right? Why do we bet kings on an ace high board when it doesn't really need that much protection? Right? But the fact is we have such a huge range advantage that when we bet a hand like kings, our opponent cannot stop us from accomplishing one of 2 things. Right? It's either we're going to have great equity when called, right, or we're going to have decent equity denial. Of course, we don't mind if he calls us with all of the lower pocket pairs, right? Then we'll be generating a lot of value, right? Good equity when called. If he folds all of those hands, then that's okay as well, right? Because we're still denying like a little bit of equity. Yeah, so that's what I thought of when I saw a spot like this. I was like, oh, maybe this is similar to why we bet kings on an A-side board, specifically when we have a huge range advantage. So far you have 2 out of 4. So this one is the deciding question. Right? So cutoff versus big blind. We're 500 big blinds deep. Right? We flop the nuts on the monotone board. After betting small on the flop and the turn, how big should we bet on the river? Do we go 66%? Do we go for a small overbet? Or do we go 27x pot all in?
Well, how I know it is that by betting small on the flop and the turn, you are basically keeping your opponent's range rather capped. So if you Galen called, then that diminishes the combos and the amount of hands that are nut hands going to the river. So while you are uncapped, because you would mix in, even betting small, you would mix in some nuts, which means you're uncapped and you're facing a capped range, which is the perfect scenario for overbets and even large or huge overbets. So probably my intuitive answer would be going all in here.
Okay. Let me play the devil's advocate for a moment. If you were to go 27x pot all in with all of your nut flashes, couldn't your opponent just adjust by slow playing all of his nuts, expecting you to put in 27 times the pot?
They could do that, but that would mean that whenever we don't go all in on the river, then they would miss out or a huge amount of EV by not raising on previous streets.
But 27 times the pot, it's probably enough to compensate for, for the EV they lose.
Yeah, that's a good point.
If we're shallow enough, for sure, there's no problem with going all in. Right? The only question is, like, is there a limit to how deep the stacks can be? Right? Is there a certain point where we just stop shoving with the nuts because it's just like too deep?
Does it play a role how many times we win the pot by bluffing?
That's a very important thing to think about. Right? When our opponent is defending versus this all-in, he's essentially trying to make our bluffs indifferent. So when our bluffs are risking 57 times the pot, he probably doesn't need to call very often to make them indifferent. Right? So there's always the risk that he's only calling like 3% of his range, right? And then 3% of his range is just like nut flushes. Okay, let me give you a hint, right? We'll calculate what MDF is.
All right.
Pot over bet plus pot 27 divided by 28. So your opponent has to defend 3.6% of his range.
Right.
The question is, do you think more than 3.6% of his range is going to be the nut flush? Right? If it is, then it doesn't seem like it would make a lot of sense to jam. Right? Or could you still jam? I don't know. You tell me.
I mean, if we only bet nut flush draws and then nut flush draw blockers, then our opponent never has the nuts, right? Then I think in that case, there is probably no limit to the size that we can bet on the river. Because anyway, your opponent cannot just only call the nuts. And if we distribute the proportions of nut flushes to nut blockers in the correct way, then they cannot exploit that.
Yeah, well then, that is in fact correct.
Hey, nice.
Yeah, there's actually no limit to how big you can go. Let's say we didn't have these nut blocker hands, right? Then we would have to be a bit more careful, right? Because the nut flush is still a significant portion of the big blind's range. And at some point, we'll be going so big that our opponent will only need to call us with the nut flush. But if you think about it, the reason why he can do that is because he's trying to make a hand like Queen 10 indifferent. And in order to do that, he doesn't need to call anything else besides the nut flush. Right? But here, versus the jam, the solver is not making Queen 10 or Queen Jack indifferent. It's specifically making hands like Ace 8 with the Ace of Clubs and Ace 9 with the Ace of Clubs. Like these are the hands that big blind has to make indifferent. And if you have a hand like ace of clubs 9, your opponent actually cannot have the nut flush. Like, so what he has to do is to call 3 to 4% of hands that are not the nut flush, right? So we actually just is part of our opponent's range, and because of that, he still has to call. 5, 3 of clubs, 9, 8 of clubs, queen, 3 of clubs. Yeah, you kind of got the correct idea, I think. Right? Like if we have the nut flush and the nut blocker, and we jam with a range of nut flush plus nut blocker, right? Then our opponent will still need to call with a bunch of hands that are not the nuts. Let us know in the comments how you scored, and don't forget to check out Victor's channel where you can see me attempt his quiz.